Thank you, Rob. And I'd like to express my thanks to the Rachel Carson Center, all the students and the staff, and my fellow fellows for all their support. It's been a great time. I actually wrote this paper during my last 2 months here, so I got something done, which is very good. And so this is a work in progress that I'll be presenting. Nevertheless, I think it's halfway polished, and the title is a little too long, according to Dan. He's probably right, but we can play with that. But the key term in the title is ecological cosmopolitanism, and this is a term that pushes back on this idea of ecological imperialism, and I'll get to a definition of this term in a moment. But this idea of cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan societies, comes also from Amitav Ghosh, and I'm just going to read the first paragraph of the paper to set up the context of cosmopolitanism. Amitav Ghosh has argued that the Indian Ocean's cosmopolitan past can be found in the language and landscapes of everyday life. His thickly layered history in an antique land, history in the guise of a traveler's tale, reconstructs the personal and business relationships of a 12th century Jewish merchant named Ben Yehu, whose trading enterprise linked people in North Africa, Arabia, and India. Ghosh then juxtaposes the unities inherent in this far-flung littoral world against their erosion and erasure in the lower Nile basin south of Alexandria, where he conducted his doctoral fieldwork among the rural peasantry. He finds the cosmopolitan past embedded on the agricultural landscape, in religious shrines and rites, and in the words of his interlocutors, but pronounced rifts have broken the continuities that Ben Yehu had taken for granted almost 1,000 years before. In this way, Ghosh uncovers the great paradox of cosmopolitan societies. They reflect an ongoing tension between unity and division. In Ghosh's globalizing world, atomization, ignorance, and intolerance had come to characterize modernity. So I'm playing with this idea also of unities and divisions on this island of Pemba, which was a very cosmopolitan place. I did it. Shoot. There's the cover of Ghosh's book. Another inspiration for the talk is The Graves of Tahreem, which is a book by Enseng Ho. It's about a place called Tahreem, which is a city. It's about a landscape, this cemetery. It's about diaspora. It's about the spreading of a Sufi way of understanding the world throughout the Indian Ocean. And it's centered on this place, which is a very famous place of pilgrimage. Tahreem is in what is today Yemen. Another inspiration is this book by Judith Carney and Richard Rosamoff, In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World. This is a book about, because my paper deals a lot with slaves and the slave trade, this is a book about how Africans rebuilt their economy, their agroecology in a very new setting, and how they sustained themselves. They were responsible for their own food production, and they used their expertise that they had, the knowledge at least of the expertise from Africa in rebuilding this new world. This is also close to Carney's work called Black Rice, where she does a similar thing for South Carolina rice plantations. Right, so this is just an outline of the larger essay. I'm going to be skipping over a lot of this, but one thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is geography. I know that most of you guys probably don't know much about Africa's geography. I'm assuming anyway that you don't know much about Africa's geography or history. I'd like to talk about cosmopolitan ecology on Pemba Island, the transformation of this type of land use that began really to take shape around the 7th century, the transformation in the 19th century when Pemba became a place that was covered with monocultural clove plantations and people from the mainland. And then the death of this plantation landscape, which all ended in 1935. Oops, wrong way. Right, so this is the working definition of ecological cosmopolitanism as practice. So the idea is that it's an amalgamation of diverse knowledge sets. It's the application of that knowledge to a particular place. It's the development of a continuity in land use practice over time. And lastly, a creation of a resilient cultural place. That is a place that can withstand perturbation. In Pemba's case, there's been a lot of that. And I argue in the paper that nevertheless, Pemba has remained a fairly healthy place through this ecological cosmopolitanism. Right, so here's Pemba. Pemba Island is a small place. It's about 984 square kilometers. From south to north, it's 67 kilometers. From east to west, it's anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 kilometers across the island. It sits at about, I think, about 3 degrees south of the equator. It's a hot place. It's a wet place. It gets about 2,000 millimeters of rainfall a year. And it's part of the Indian Ocean monsoon system, which I'll talk about in just a second. It has 2 pronounced rainy seasons. But it rains so much on Pemba, it can rain just about any day of the year. But much of that rain comes in March and April, or in November and December. Let's go. And just for your reference, Pemba is part of Zanzibar. Zanzibar consists of 2 islands. This one, Unguja is the more famous island. And this was the seat of the Zanzibar Sultanate, the British colonial government. It's the place where tourists go for vacations. Beautiful beaches on the east side of Unguja Island. Pemba is about 50 miles north of Unguja, and it's lesser known. It's considered a very isolated place right now, even though historically it was not. It's considered in East Africa the seat of the occult and witchcraft. If you want to become a witch, this is where you go. You go to Pemba to learn the craft. It's considered a kind of a dangerous place. Some people consider it a backward place, but we'll learn more about it. This is the larger context of Pemba's history, the East African mainland. And I make a case in the paper that the cosmopolitan ecology that formed on Pemba was very much part of its Africa background. Let's see if I got the point here. Right here is Mount Kilimanjaro. These are the western Rift Valley lakes, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria. Mount Kenya is up here. This is the Tana River. The thing that I want to point out is this is a very diverse landscape. It goes from very arid to very wet along the coast. These highland areas are very fertile farmlands. And Pemba is part of a 2,000-year history of migration called the Bantu migration. Maybe you've heard about this. People who speak Bantu languages from the Niger-Congo family migrated into eastern and southern Africa beginning about 2,000 years ago. And they brought innovation in technology. They brought ironworking. They brought their language, which is spoken as Kiswahili all along the coast. They brought innovation in village organization, land tenure systems, and they actually settled the East African coast in what is today Pemba. One of the also the important things about Bantu culture, especially as it's expressed in these highland areas and along the coast, is the veneration of ancestors, an animism, an animistic culture, where people ascribe life to what we would consider inanimate objects like water, trees, forests, rocks. And these shrines are found all over East Africa. I'm very interested in the sacred groves, these places where people are buried. They're basically cemetery sites. And I'll be pointing out a couple of them on maps of Pemba in just a minute. So these sacred groves, this idea of ancestor veneration, found its way to Pemba as well. And this is the larger picture, stepping back. This is the cosmopolitan picture of Pemba's geography, the Indian Ocean. It has very close ties to this part of Arabia, which is Yemen, very close ties to Oman, to the western Indian coast, to the Persian Gulf region, especially Basra, and to the Horn of Africa. All of these places engaged in a trading system that by the 12th century was really the center of the world economy. And that trading system was made popular by another geographical feature of the Indian Ocean, and that is the monsoon system, which brings a wind pattern out of the northwest during half of the year and a wind pattern rotating the other way during the other half of the year, which allowed merchants from across these regions to reach the East African coast in one rainy season and return in the next rainy season. This was theoretically possible for people to make that trip in 1 year. What people did, however, was they hung around. They might be in Yemen. This is Ben Yehu, Gosha's merchant. He would go to Aden. He was in Cairo. These people moved easily across this ocean littoral, and so there was a lot of contact. And Pemba became one of those places of contact. Right. So we're switching gears here from geography to a Pemba-centered story now. And this is, in the paper I write a story about a road trip that I took when I first got to Pemba. And this road trip was guided by this guy. His name is Ali. And Ali was my mentor and my teacher for that one day. And I talk about us going through the island of northern Pemba and experiencing some of the divisiveness, some of the intolerance that Ghosh speaks about in his book. And at the same time, Mzee Ali was pointing out to me some of the remnants of this cosmopolitanism. What he's pointing out here, first of all, this is a very large tree. I believe it's an orange tree. You can just see the base of it here. It's covered with vines, and these vines are vanilla. He was pointing out to me this kind of agro-ecological landscape that is full of spices, it's full of herbs, it's anchored by trees, people plant banana groves and cassava underneath it. It's a very diverse horticultural landscape in a very small space. And he was pointing that out to me at that moment. I go on for quite a while about Mzee Ali in the paper, but I'm not going to today. It would take too long. But Mzee Ali, another important thing about him is his hat. He's wearing what's called in Kiswahili a kofia. A kofia, this kofia is an embroidered hat, and it designates that he is a Muslim. That's part of his Swahili identity. Another part of his identity is his language, Kiswahili. His hometown, Gando, the place where he comes from, where he hails from. His putative Arabian descent, which he claims, probably incorrectly. This is Mzee Ali. He's a Swahili man. He identifies with Pemba as his home, but also with this far-flung empire of the Indian Ocean. Mzee Ali took me to this place. It's called Mkiawangombe. I always got, people gave me a lot of shit about the way I pronounced that. Mkiawangombe, especially Pembans. It means the tail of the cow. Mkiawangombe. Mkiawangombe, we went there and we met this old guy who was very talkative, and he came up and sort of got in our face, and we wondered what he was all about. And he was telling us about this Persian ruin, and sure enough, there it was. And I walked into this ruined area. There's a lot of vegetation here, and you can see just the arch of what was a mosque entryway and one of the pillars of that mosque. That's an 11th century mosque. That's part of the Indian Ocean Cosmopolitan on Pemba, and there are other such ruins. Right next to this ruin was the town's mava, was the cemetery that represented that African history, that continuity with the African past, a place where ancestors were interred, a place where occult practices are very common. So this juxtaposition of these two places was very interesting to me in our tour. But that's all I'm going to say about Mzee Ali for now. And I'm going to go to discussion. Well, here's a Swahili man. I just wanted to speak very briefly about this guy and what he represents in Swahili culture, because there's a lot of contradictions in Swahili culture. This guy's wearing a kofia like Mzee Ali. It's embroidered, it's beautiful. He's also wearing a white robe called a kanzu. A kanzu is formal wear. You'd wear it to the mosque on Friday, to a funeral, to a wedding. Behind him are these alcoves in a beautifully painted, whitewashed wall. And in Swahili history, these alcoves would have contained Chinese porcelain. They would have been a representation of a person's wealth and connections to that larger trading world. Also, the only thing really African about this guy is the color of his skin. And that is one of the ways that Swahili culture has been characterized in the past. That this guy has some sort of relationship to Arabia or Persia, that he would live in a stone house, that he considers people from the African mainland to be barbarians. In fact, they call them washenzi, fools, or watuabara, people of the road, people of the interior. They would have a very, very derogatory view of such people. But I argue in the paper that this is really not correct. This is very superficial, this kind of look at Swahili, and that Swahili history is very much grounded in Africa. So I'm going to take us now to Pemba Island, the northern side of Pemba Island. Whoops, you were right, Ash. So right up here is where we're going to be zooming in on Google Earth to a place called Tumbe. This is the town of Tumbe as it exists today. But Tumbe was an was the site of an archaeological dig a few years back. And Tumbe was considered before this archaeological dig, there was a Swahili Persian ruin nearby, the ruin of a mosque. It was considered to have been one of these transplanted cities from Arabia. However, Tumbe, actually, these archaeologists who did recent work there found that it was a pre-7th century or middle 7th century settlement. It's pre-Islamic. They also found at Tumbe was a town, but there was no hierarchy to Tumbe. There were no stone buildings, for example, that are associated with this Arab architecture. People lived in what was basically a large African village, and they produced crafts that were traded into that Indian Ocean, that pre-Islamic Indian Ocean area. They were producing shell beads. They were producing, let's see if I can get this, right down here is a mangrove forest. Mangrove poles were cut and traded into this world. Cowrie shells as well. Ironworking was practiced here from the East African mainland. So Tumbe is a Swahili African settlement that predates this Swahili guy with his kofia, that conceptualization of the cosmopolitan, and a very densely populated place. And it represents this kind of openness. Another thing that's found at Tumbe on the ground here, this is a rice paddy. Rice is an Asian crop. Rice was grown at Tumbe probably for over 1,000 years. My pointer's not working here, so I'll just point with my... So here's the rice paddy. This is the Mava. This is the sacred grove of Tumbe right here. It's probably, what these cemeteries are old settlement sites, an old village site. What else did I want to point out here? Right here, you can't see it, but there are a bunch of small dhows, the fishing boats. Tumbe is again a very densely populated town, as you can see. It's not a big town, but it holds on to this past, this continuity with the Indian Ocean world, but in a way that's very localized. So we've got rice production. You can't see the larger trees here with the bigger canopies, like right here, that's a mango tree. Mango trees are another Asian import into this area that have a very long antiquity. At the same time, people in the 7th century were growing millet and sorghum. These are crops that are now found in India, that are very important African crops that have been taken to India. So this exchange system predates the Swahili Islamic world. Right, this is Chakwa nearby. This is the remains of a small mosque at Chakwa. Okay, so that's a picture of the past. An image is the 7th century Tumbe, and we're going to move forward in time to Pemba in the 19th century. Pemba in the 19th century was part of a trade network that was moving slaves across the Indian Ocean from the African mainland. Usually we associate the slave trade with the Atlantic world, but in the Indian Ocean world there was also a very, very large commerce in slaves. They were, as you can see from these arrows, they were moving all over the place. This map says from 1500 to 1900. The slave trade I'm going to talk about represents something new, a break in these trade patterns. And that is a slave trade that wasn't carrying slaves to these areas, but was carrying slaves from the African mainland to these two islands. So this is a picture of the Omani Empire. Because of the connections between Arabia and Africa for long periods of time, people from Oman, especially merchant families, had gained toeholds on the East African coast. In the late 18th and early 19th century, Oman was going through a political transition from a religious state that was headed by an imam to a more secularized state where powerful merchant families were holding sway. One of those families was the Busaidi family from Muscat. They decided, because of political difficulties, because of some dangers they faced from assassination, to move their capital from Muscat to Zanzibar in the 1820s. And they basically took over what is today Zanzibar town. They were very wealthy. They endowed the town with religious institutions. They built houses and palaces. They basically built Stone Town as you will find it today when you go to Zanzibar. I hope you do go to Zanzibar. Very interesting place. At the same time, Zanzibar was a very cosmopolitan place. So the Omanis from Muscat were Ibadis. They were not Sunni Muslims. They were very much close. They're very close to Shia Islam. But in Zanzibar, you'll find mosques from all denominations of Islam. Anyway, back to the story. At the same time, the Omanis had moved to Zanzibar. They began experimenting by planting a few clove trees, and they found that cloves grew really well. In the 1840s, there was a boom in clove prices. Price jumped, skyrocketed, and the Omanis began planting en masse clove trees on Unguja and Pemba. Because they had the power to do so, they took over most of the land on both of those islands, and they introduced a monoculture of clove trees. By the early 20th century, there were over 2 million clove trees on the island of Pemba. Right. They were not unfamiliar with tree plantations. This is a date plantation. You can't really see it. It's too light in here. But this is a date plantation in Oman. Then we come down here. This is a clove plantation on the island of Pemba. Again, these trees have a kind of characteristic conical shape. However, they only live for about 50 to 70 years. They start producing after 5 years. So the Omanis began making a fortune by distributing lands among their family members and friends on Unguja and Pemba, by planting these thousands and thousands of clove trees, and by bringing slaves from the African mainland to maintain these clove plantations and pick the cloves and to carry them to market. The slave trade, this is Tipu Tip. This was a famous Swahili man. His mother was Omani, his father was African, and he headed an empire that stretched into the East African interior. He had houses up here at Ujiji, in Central Africa, also on Zanzibar Island, and he was the chief merchant of a trade that was bringing tons of ivory out of this Eastern and Central Africa. That ivory was used to make billiard balls, strangely. And slaves, mostly. Other commodities as well, but mostly ivory and slaves were coming out of the interior, to the point where by the 1850s, about 10,000 slaves were landed on the island of Pemba every year. And of those 10,000 slaves from the African mainland, about 10% of them died every year, either from cholera, smallpox, or malaria. So there was a huge turnover, a huge demand for replenishing these slave supplies. By the beginning of the 20th century, in fact, Pemba's population, the majority of Pemba's population was either people who had just been manumitted from slavery or the descendants of those slaves. So it was mostly a slave population. It became dominated by these people. So let's just look at this plantation landscape and what kind of people were working there. This is it's a clove tree. These are pickers. But you don't see these. These women have their back turned to the camera. Most of the slaves were women. Most of them were young women. They don't want to have their picture taken because they believed that the camera was somehow removing something spiritual from them. Move on to another picture. This is a picture of slave women taken by Quaker missionaries at a watering station on the island of Pemba. You can see that one of the things they're wearing is cotton cloth. Whoops, wrong way. This was a big import from the United States and Britain, sold on the mainland. These women are not dressed as Swahili people. It's very clear that they are slaves. Their hairstyles, the way their ears are pierced, the openings in their ears. It's one of the few pictures we have of slaves anywhere in East Africa. And they don't look too happy. They're kind of angry at the camera. They're angry at this person for taking a picture of them without their permission. These tins they have are what they're filling with water. Those tins would have contained ghee, a kind of butter, clarified butter that was used in cooking, and then they'd reuse these tins to carry water, which they would have carried on their heads. These are the people who are rebuilding Pemba's landscape within these clove plantations. These people had to produce their own food. And they were bringing from the mainland their own ideas about how to farm. And they began farming on the edges of the clove plantations. This is just some of the work that people were doing. Cloves have to be picked within a very short amount of time, within 2 weeks of their ripening. They have to be picked and then they're spread out on these mats to dry. There's another picture of a slave plantation where these, very, very huge area devoted to drying these cloves. But they can't get wet. So if it starts raining, they have to be brought into that shed and out of the rain very, very quickly. They're also bagged and carried to market. They had to be taken to the island of Unguja, where they were taxed by the Sultan, and then shipped off to India and England, where most of the cloves were going. So what I'm arguing in the paper is that these slaves, who we don't see here, are rather silently rebuilding a landscape. And you can even see it in this picture. If we look over here, this is a mango tree. These are banana trees. These are coconut trees. This is obviously somebody's farm. It's not part of the clove plantation. This is where slaves were building their agricultural landscape. In the paper I talk about, don't lean on that. Okay. The kinds of landscapes they were building. I developed this from an observation of a surveyor who went to Pemba in 1911. And he found pretty mature peasant-style agriculture taking place within the clove plantations. And he noted certain types of African trees that were only found on the mainland before that. Kapok trees, these are big, huge cotton, they grow very fast, and they're used on the mainland to mark market sites or village sites. He found physic nut trees. These are trees from America, but they're grown on the mainland to produce poisons, to produce medicine. They're used by witches, more or less. He found all kinds of plants, cassava, sweet potatoes, crops that were grown on the mainland by these people, when in their non-slave lives, being planted on Pemba. So what I'm arguing in the paper is that this type of agriculture, this type of change that produces this landscape that I saw with Mzee Ali, this is what's happening on the plantation landscape. As the plantations are slowly dying. Slavery ended in 1896, very late, one of the latest places in the world. But once the slaves started, once they received manumission, they stopped working for these Arab landowners, but they continued living on the land, and they transformed it. And that's really the point of the paper, is this transformation. The last part of the paper is called The Death of the Plantation Landscape. These plantation owners, these Omani Arabs, found themselves by the early 20th century in a great deal of debt. There are good years in clove production, there are bad years in clove production. It's a typical kind of boom and bust commodity. So during the bad years, they borrowed a lot of money that they weren't able to pay back. So by the 1930s, most clove plantations were owned by Indian bankers. And they decided they wanted to subdivide their property. And the British, who by then were the colonial masters of Zanzibar, decided this wasn't a very good idea, because they idealized this plantation landscape. They believed that it made a lot of money, and that they believed, and they were very racist, there's no question about that, they believed that the Omani Arabs were on a higher racial scale, they were smarter, that they were better stewards of the land. So they passed a series of laws designed to protect the plantation landscape and to stop this kind of agriculture. They failed, but I found a poem, a really interesting poem from 1934, 1935, that talked about this land decree of 1934, and it was written by a Swahili poet, and it really expresses this kind of bitterness for these Indian merchants, these Indian bankers, and an idealization of this plantation landscape worked by slaves. Well, by 35, it was over. The writing was on the wall. These plantations weren't viable anymore. And this type of agriculture that has such a long continuity on Pemba, with some new additions, new trees, new ideas from the mainland, this is what remained on, this was what remains today on the landscape. I'm just going to take the last 2 minutes to read the conclusions of my paper, and then we'll open it up. If I can find them. Right. First, land use legacies are persistent. Those legacies, if you know what you're looking for and you walk around on Pemba today, you can find them everywhere. This long continuity of resiliency and sustainability. Landscape history is linked materially and perceptually to other places in a broad geography. We can see that in the rice, in the coconuts, in the bananas, in the citrus trees, and in almost, many, many plants, probably the majority of plants on Pemba, agricultural plants, are from somewhere else. The elders I spoke to on Pemba often mentioned the importance of travel, this idea of someplace else being important, of sojourn. Historical contingency matters. I didn't mention it earlier, but in 1872, a hurricane destroyed all the clove trees on Unguja Island, and clove production and slavery shifted dramatically to Pemba. So after 1872, Pemba became the center of world clove production. Number 4, the Omani plantation period dominated much of Pemba's landscape for about a century. In a long-term view, this is an anomaly. This is something that is just a blip on the landscape history of Pemba's island, and it failed. Finally, the end of slavery brought what British observers thought to be inertia and stagnation to the clove industry in Pemba. They were so worried about the future. This view, grounded in racism, hubris, and ignorance, underscored the power of migrants and ex-slaves to build new landscapes under the noses of the powers that be. In their inability to see change, plantation owners and their British rulers held on to a damaging myth of prosperity under the domination of cloves. That myth fed into another eruption of violence on Pemba in the early 1960s, the revolution on Zanzibar. But that's a story for another time. So thank you very much.